So again, welcome. My name is Maya Tarashvili. I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you everyone for joining us. Today's discussion is somewhat of a follow-up to our event that we held on Monday, which was about the one-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We talked about some of the key implications of this war on Ukraine, on European security, on transatlantic unity, transatlantic relations. But today's discussion is focused on this war's implications on Russia primarily. So like I mentioned, on the 24th of February, we marked 1 year anniversary since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This war still goes on. Some predict that it will go on for the rest of this year. Recently, President Zelensky of Ukraine said that he believes Ukraine can win this war within this year, but most of certainly my Western colleagues and experts I've spoken to do not anticipate that it will end anytime soon. So the tragedy continues to unfold, and its implications are immense. I think one of the issues we talk about a little bit less is what's happening within Russia amid this war and what the war has meant for Russian life and society. So today I'm joined by three of my colleagues. All three of them happen to be fellows within our Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I have here Olga Khvostunova, who is a fellow in our Eurasia program. She's a journalist, researcher, and political analyst. She holds a PhD from the Moscow State University School of Journalism and is the co-author of Media and Politics and Media in Changing Russia. And she has worked at the Institute for Modern Russia since 2011. We have benefited from Olga's writings and analysis over the past year since she joined us. It's been just about a year since Olga has become a fellow with us. I strongly encourage you to read some of her latest work that's published on our website, and we will share in the chat feature on this Zoom screen. We're also joined by Aaron Schwartzbaum, who is, again, a fellow in our Eurasia program. He's also the founder of FPRI's Bear Market Brief newsletter, which has expanded over the last year and a half or so. It now features the Bear Market Brief podcast, which is hosted by Aaron Schwartzbaum. I strongly recommend that you subscribe to our podcasts, our chain reaction podcasts at FPRI, but particularly the Bear Market Brief podcast, because Aaron keeps just bringing some of the most interesting guests and has some of the most interesting conversations that we just cannot get enough of. So I highly recommend that. And we also have Andres Toth-Zifra, who is also a Eurasia Program Fellow at FPRI. Andres is a political analyst from Hungary based in New York City. And currently he is one of the key contributors to FPRI's Bear Market Brief newsletter. So again, make sure you're subscribed to that one because it does take deep dives on what's happening within Russia right now. Again, sort of the angle that we spend much less time paying attention to because we're so much more focused on the war's implications outside Russia, certainly and fairly, primarily in Ukraine. But I'm going to kick this off. I'm going to keep this as conversational as possible. We are not going to do too many prepared remarks. I would like to invite our audience to use the Q&A feature as much as possible.
Olga, let's start with you, if we might. So wanted to ask a question about public sentiment relating to the war. Initially, we saw fairly significant anti-war demonstrations throughout much of Russia. The world expected all Russians to be outraged over this invasion. A lot of folks, as per time-honored tradition, predicted that the Putin regime would quickly be overthrown. But over time, we saw a boost in Putin's approval ratings. Tell us a little bit about public opinion in the war. What explains Russia's general acceptance of what's happening?
Yes, this is one of the key questions, I guess, regarding the situation in Russia since the war started. So I think there are two sides to it. One is why there are no large-scale protests against the war in Russia. And the second one is what's actually happening with the public opinion. So I guess I'll start with the latter part. So to understand that, we have to understand what the Russian public is. So just a couple of factors, I think, sort of explain the current acceptance of the war and of Putin's policies. So one factor is that about 50% of the Russian adult population are dependent on the state. So these are so-called budget workers. So they are like law enforcement officers, teachers, medical workers, etc. Bureaucrats, of course. So if you're dependent on the state, it's really hard for you to not support state policies. The second part is that Russia has been, by many scholars, defined as personalist authoritarian state or regime. And within this regime, again, it's really hard for an average person to speak out against the government, against the regime, because your rights and your freedoms are fairly limited, and there are very few incentives for you to do so. So you have this sort of dependent and limited in many aspects public, and then this crisis happens, and the question is, how do you react to it? So what we saw initially within the first week following the invasion, a large-scale anti-war protest, or rather many protests across entire Russia and abroad. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets, signed anti-war petitions, spoke out against it on social media. But this momentum ended fairly quickly as well after the Russian government sort of cracked down on all kinds of expression of anti-war sentiment by passing repressive legislation. For example, the key element to this was anti-fake, or rather legislation that forbids to spread fake information against the Russian army, or even calling the war by its rightful name and call it special military operation. And it's a criminal offense with a potential punishment of up to 15 years in prison. And so you have, again, unprecedented crackdown on protesters. Tens of thousands of people were detained. There are many criminal cases, administrative cases against people who tried to protest. Independent media was essentially outlawed in Russia. So you have a large toolkit of repressive methods that the Russian government employed, which ended this visible anti-war movement. But it doesn't mean it stopped. There are still very small dispersed protests taking place across Russia. According to Over the Info, which is an independent project that tracks protest activity, there were only, I think, 29 days over the year where there were no detentions related to anti-war actions in Russia. And now, sort of, once you silence the opposition, you are left with the majority, which is state dependent and limited in their ways to express anti-government attitudes. So it's a very interesting situation. We see consistent rate of support for the war from 60 to 80% of the respondents saying that they support the war, which is a big question. Do they really support the war, or they just say that they support it? And there is no, it's really difficult to separate the two. What sociologists say is that even if they don't support the war, if they personally think it's wrong, still the respondents accept that the social norm is to say that you support it. And so that means that you will behave in ways that will support or show support for the war. So still, this is a number that should not be discounted as, you know, some sort of propaganda number. There is still declarative support for the war by the majority of the population. But there has been some, I think, interesting polls recently by independent pollsters, and I want to quote one of them. Was conducted in February by an independent project called Chronicles. And it sort of tried to dissect and sort of dig deeper into support versus opposition to the war, and established that there are two different cores of support versus opposition. So about 22% of the respondents or Russian population support the war consciously. That means they don't just say that they support it, but they actually believe in the declared goals, and they actually believe that they need to conquer Ukraine or whatever, support the goals, proclaimed goals of the war. And the opposition core is actually 20%. So we have this sort of polarization of supporters versus opponents of the war, and none of them constitute a strong majority. So the question is, where do the 60% of the rest of the population go? And it's a $1 million question. So I guess the government and, you know, the opposition are trying to attract these numbers to their side. I just want to say a few words about those who support the war, about those 22% who are staunch supporters. They tend to be older. They tend to be more 55 plus. They tend to watch state television. They tend to be male. And surprisingly, they tend to be more affluent rather than poor, which came as a surprise to a lot of observers. And so it is also interesting that only about 20% of the respondents cannot name the goal of the war. So even a year in, every fifth person doesn't know why Russia invaded Ukraine. And among those who do know, the top three answers are the propaganda cliches. So denazify Ukraine, protect Russia from NATO, or return Russian land. So this is basically within the line of the narrative that the Kremlin tries to put out. But I found one interesting shift in the most sort of recent service, that is the turn among those who support the war into more willingness to participate in it. So about 55% of Russian males are now saying that they're willing to participate in the war. And I think one of the reasons is that after mobilization was declared in Russia, and after it became clear that the war is there to stay, considering the sunk cost of the war, it is clear to a lot of people that even if, you know, if you stop the war, if you withdraw the troops, it doesn't mean that Ukraine will accept it. And so there is a sentiment that, you know, Ukraine will try to revenge whatever Russia has done to the country. And so this is where we are now.
Olga, thank you so much. Aaron, thank you so much for jumping in. I apologize for my technical difficulty. There's a friend for everything. My Zoom just kind of completely shut down. But Aaron, thank you for picking up where I left off. Olga, thank you so much. Before I turn it over to Aaron with my question, let me quickly ask you, do you think that, how reliable is the information we're about to get from Russia, especially when it comes to public opinion polling, statistics? We know that so many organizations like the Levada Center, which used to be like the go-to, right, for information like this, we know they've all been under, you know, attack. So to begin with, when you do this research, when you look at this information, how reliable is the information that we used to rely on in the past? And, what are some of the sources that you have found sort of most adequate for your work?
Right. This is one of the questions that's been, debated over the last year. How trustworthy are those numbers, even coming from Levada? So Levada itself argued that they're still trustworthy, and they conducted their own internal research to prove that you can still sort of rely on the general trend that these numbers represent. So also over the last year, I think 2 other independent pollsters emerged as interesting, and I've been relying on their numbers as well. So one of them I mentioned is the independent project called Chronicle. So they have 9 waves of surveys that they have been doing over the last year about the war. The founder is an independent politician, Alexei Manulov, I think his first name, maybe not Alexei, but his last name is Manulov. He used to work with Navalny's team. And the other is Russian Field, also an independent pollster. They are using sort of new marketing methods to approach their respondents. However, all of these pollsters point out that the response rate has been much has dropped basically from about 10-15%, which is usual, to about 4 or 5%. So a lot of people who participate in this service, they either drop off immediately when they're approached by pollsters, because pollsters are often perceived as some sort of part of the state apparatus, or they don't like questions and they just they are afraid to respond to them. But again, even based on this limited data, and I think we'll have even more limited data going forward, there is still some trends that we can observe. And I mean, over the year, we still see that Russians do support the war, unfortunately. The number or the percentage is debatable, but it's still there. It's palpable. So.
Thank you so much, Olga. I want to turn this over to Aaron. Aaron, let's step back a little bit and talk about the fact that this war has been going on for over a year now, but initially, most experts predicted, maximum 48 hours before Kyiv would fall and before Moscow would win the war. I want to ask you how you see some of the miscalculations that the Kremlin made, the motivations behind this full-scale invasion. What was your reaction initially? Did you expect that this would happen? And are you surprised that the war went on or has gone on for as long as it has? How do you view sort of the decision-making process and some of those major miscalculations that we've seen from the Russian side?
Well, where to even start here? Let's start with the kind of the initial premise of the question. How do we even know that Russia miscalculated the war? Russia's taken Ukrainian territory. There may be a school of thought that says, hey, Russia's doing all right. But how do we know Russia actually did rather grievously miscalculate? We have evidence from the initial days of the war. The conduct of Russian military operations suggests that Russian leadership was counting on a very, as the saying goes, a short, successful, short little victorious war. Couple of pieces of evidence for that are Russian soldiers wearing ceremonial gear, having their St. George ribbons, which are these orange and black ribbons, symbol of victory. It's what Russians would crack out for Victory Day in May, celebrating the victory in World War II. So indications that this would be a triumphal entrance into Kyiv, and that would be that. We also see, as far as the military tactics employed, driving in long lines of vehicles allows you to move fast, but it's very dangerous if you're actually anticipating you're going to meet enemies who are going to shoot back at you. So we saw these columns that rolled into the Kiev suburbs get absolutely chewed up and decimated. And again, that seems to be an indication that Russia thought this would go a lot faster than it did. I think this third piece is an article that appears to have been accidentally published in Rossiyskaya Gazeta, which is the kind of government's official newspaper that basically hailed this victory and basically describes what would now happen to the former area that Ukraine used to exist in. So I think a pretty clear indication of how Putin and his inner circle thought that this may play out. It did not play out that way. So that is my kind of operating assumption here. Let's talk about the scale of this error. And this is one of my favorite parlor happy hour discussions with people in the field. What is the scale of this foreign policy blunder? What does it compare to? The best answer we've been able to come up with in my conversations so far is somewhere in between the Vietnam War and Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor. This is not a conflict that bears any risk to Russia's existence as a state currently. But the casualty count is already higher than Vietnam. And the difference with Vietnam is that it's at least more understandable that the United States at the time got pulled in year by year. It was a slow process, sunk costs. We have to keep fighting. Russia did this all at once. This has been 1 year and has racked up a casualty count, people believe, between 100 and 150,000 soldiers. That's quite a significant number. So let's now turn to why this miscalculation occurred in the first place. So I want to, Scout's honor here, disavow any Kremlinology as I try to answer this question. And for those who may not be folks who study the region, Kremlinology meaning just inside baseball, reading the tea leaves. Russian media space and information space is a little less transparent. And so I'm going to try not to assume or guess. I'm going to try to go based purely on what information is publicly available and what there's evidence for. Criminology is really fun, but there's a lot of rumors out there, and we don't want to give that too much credence. So let's talk about structural factors, factors that aren't particularly about Russia, but are describe the situation more broadly. One structural factor is autocratic information bubbles. Olga described Russian governance as personalist authoritarian. There's not institutions, or the institutions play second fiddle to actual figures, so Putin in this case. But authoritarian governments, and especially leadership circles, are prone to having bad intelligence, to just not getting relevant information. And I'm not trying to make a value judgment comparison, but Nazi Germany, Hitler and his inner circle, I think would be a good example where these leaders in positions of power, especially who have been in power a long time, their worldview shrinks. They stop getting useful information or truthful information, especially in societies and authoritarian ones where the truth may actually be punished. There's very strong incentives not to report the correct information further up the chain. We see evidence of this. There's a recent article in Politico about how Western, US government and Western leaders realized that Russia was actually going to invade Ukraine. It's a long read, but the weekend's coming up, so I would highly recommend it. And one of the things that struck me in this article that kept coming up is how Russian diplomats and fairly senior level folks would read the usual talking points, but again and again, the interlocutors and the people who spoke with Politico for this article came away with the sense that these folks they were talking to in Moscow were just not read into the plan at all. They just didn't know what Putin and his much more inner circle were actually thinking about. Another structural factor, which is about Russia, but can explain the situation more generally, is corruption as a piece of as a factor in this information environment. So that has two pieces. Most folks, myself included, and I'm sure many of the panelists here today, anyone who had spoken to a Ukrainian would have known that, hey, if Russia rolled into Ukraine, Ukrainians would take arms and fight. One of my favorite anecdotes was back in 2014. I was studying in Russia at the time, tutoring a kid in English. and I was talking to his parents about politics, and they said they have friends in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, predominantly Russian-speaking city, and they said that their friends said, "Hey, we're ethnic Russian, we speak Russian, and if Russia comes to our city, we're going to pick up guns and defend it." So yeah, we had evidence for this back 8 years ago when this war technically started. So there's corruption in the conduct of Russian intelligence gathering. Again, not a kind of difficult conclusion to come to that Ukrainians would fight. There's also corruption as far as Russian military modernization. I think it is pretty clear that Russian leadership in the inner circle around Putin anticipated that Russia's military would be far stronger than it actually was. And that is because of a culture of conducting large-scale exercises that are more parades than actual tests with adversity, a belief that military modernization had been thorough and produced equipment that would function well. But I think a lot of this also boils down to, equipment aside, just frankly bad planning. So let's now turn to the personal side. What is about Putin here? What is about Russia specifically? And again, trying to only stick to things that we have evidence for. So part of this is, we'll learn some Russian slang today. Word or phrase of the day, bunkerny ded, is basically bunker grandpa, and it's what some younger Russians are calling Putin, who's, especially during COVID, he was, as a political figure, never particularly attached to the people and would always be very uncomfortable in unscripted situations with regular people. He retreated further from the public eye during COVID, would spend a lot of time isolated. You saw, as the war became increasingly evident, that's what was going to happen. The length of the tables he would meet with foreign leaders with. There's lots of rumors about, maybe he has a long-term illness. That's criminology we're not going to get into. But yes, he's been increasingly isolated. And I think a sign of that is that this war, by all indications, appears to have been planned entirely within, or mostly within, Putin's own head. That there did not appear to have been an institutional or social consensus that existed before the war. I think evidenced by the fact that the war wasn't really prompted by any particular development. There wasn't, I don't know, if Ukraine had launched a ballistic missile or had actually invaded or tried to forcibly retake, is a better word, forcibly retake Donbass. That's a change on the ground. And there wasn't particular change on the ground. I'd remind viewers and listeners here that before the war, is kind of hard to believe as it is, Zelensky's popularity rating was about 25%. Nothing was happening in Ukraine particularly to threaten Russia in any meaningful sense. Ukraine accession, NATO accession for Ukraine wasn't forthcoming anytime soon. So this appears to have been something that Putin, spending a lot of time in isolation, was thinking about. I think another big piece of Russia's miscalculation, Putin has demonstrated disdain and mistrust of uncontrolled democracy. And I think that leaders, it's not just true of Russia, tend to view other countries the way that things exist in their own country, through the lens of their own lived experience. And I think Putin rather significantly discounted Western cohesion surrounding the war. I think he underestimated the strength of an actual democratic consensus, concluding after Syria, after Crimea, after the prior war in Ukraine, after COVID, seeing protests, that the West was not going to unite and take a tougher line and supply military assistance to Ukraine. I think thinking that the resolve wasn't there, and not understanding that democratic resolve is often more of a threshold that had built up over the years. And this was finally the piece that particularly Europe, I think, made Europe feel actually threatened. And so I think that is another critical piece here. So a lot of thoughts there, but I think those are the kind of critical factors you need to understand if you're talking about why Russia got this so tragically wrong.
Thank you, Erin. Yes, I think all those points are extremely valuable and relevant. And I think, another evidence for why this was clearly a miscalculation, although I really like the provocative statement about how, well, was it actually a miscalculation? One of the pieces of evidence that we have is just how costly the war has been, how financially, economically, it really in every way isolating this has been for Russia, how punishing the war has been for Russia. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andras, who keeps a close eye on the Russian economy. This has clearly become a war of attrition. Whoever runs out of the might to continue fighting this very bloody kinetic warfare is the one who's going to lose. At least that's where we are right now. So Andres, tell us about how the Russian economy is doing. Again, on the surface, we expected that it would collapse within a couple of months in view of the Western and international sanctions, but here we are. When you look at the basic economic indicators, it seems like the Russian economy is doing okay. But tell us about let's take a deeper dive into the economic situation in Russia.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are listening from. So I think there are two key questions about the framework in which we look at the economy. And I think both Olga and Erin have touched upon these two key questions. The first one is, of course, how do we know how the Russian economy is doing? Where do we take the data from? Is that data reliable? We know that Russia had been, even before the war, restricting access to key indicators, in certain cases changing how these indicators were calculated. And since the war, they have restricted the release of publicly available data even more, or enabled companies to do so with the explicit purpose of hindering sanctions and hindering Western governments in their effort to monitor the effective sanctions. I'm not going to go into all of this because we have already discussed this not so long ago with Erin and Chris Miller on FPRI's podcast. And we dropped a link to that episode in the chat box. But if I want to be really short about it, there is still data coming out of Russia. In certain cases, there was a pushback from some of the technocratic so-called pockets of efficiency in the Russian government and the sort of broadly understood Russian government, for instance, from the central bank, because the restriction of publicly available data is not always conducive to, or it's usually not conducive to companies making good investment decisions. So we have certain data points to base our assessment on. And the second key question is, what do we make of this data? And not just in a vacuum, because as you mentioned, Maya, if we just look at the numbers, for instance, the Russian growth, or rather recession numbers from 2022, minus 2.1%, it's not a devastating blow, or so it seems. But we need to understand what is behind the data and in what context this data comes up. And this very peculiar context is Russia's very peculiar decision-making system. And I think what you said about the two sides trying to outlast each other, and certainly it seems to be this seems to be the strategy from Russia's part, just trying to hold the line and express the especially image or radiate an image of strength and the ability to withstand further and further blows with much social upheaval or without a blow to the war's domestic support that Olga talked about, and to tell the West, well, we can be in it for a longer time, and our willpower is and our reserves in all senses of the word are stronger than yours. So I think this is the context in which we need to look at these numbers, because this prompts the Russian government to sort of try to minimize these risks, everything that that could lead to domestic upheaval. They are going to address them, and they are going to put money there, and they are going to put sort of administrative capacity there domestically, but often this comes at the cost of long-term stability and long-term development. So we can see this, for instance, in how the budget for the next couple of years was drawn up, how all expenses related to military and related to domestic security agencies are heavily front-loaded, and they are leading to significantly larger expenses than what the budget can finance. In the this is already the case in the last months of 2022, and certainly from what we see from January, this is still the case. So I would say that probably the main feat of the Russian government last year is that they avoided a quick collapse. They avoided a loss of trust. It just was down to two main things. First, the pocket of efficiency that is Russia's central bank and its and some of the other technocrats in the government. And second, that the fiscal receipts rose on the back of windfall energy revenues, which were mostly realized in the first half of the year, but sort of carried the budget enough to avoid major ructions in the Russian economy or in Russia's fiscal space. Now, 2023 is going to be different, but I would say that this combination of a shrewd monetary policy and windfall revenues and the staggered effects on Western sanctions on industries that hit various industries at different times, right? Like they hit the automotive industry first, and then they hit metallurgy, they hit coal mining, they hit the timber industry, and had downstream effects on other industries as well, allowed the government to sort of flatten the curve, to use a metaphor from what feels now like another era, and instead of having a big short-term crisis, Russia is going to have a devastating, but still devastating, but a longer-term one.
Thank you so much, Andras. I think that was really informative. I want to start bringing in some of the audience questions. The first one comes from Scotty Scottsko. I want to turn this over to Olga and then maybe also Aaron for commentary. The question says, what's your perception of the role of the relationship between the army and the Wagner Group? And does this have political ramifications that could shape the course of the war? I want to go to Olga first with the question of also, like, what is the domestic perception of the Wagner Group and its role in this war, but also its role in how the Kremlin's sort of might is perceived, military might is perceived. And then I would love to hear any of your thoughts also, Aaron, about the Wagner Group and its role, again, not only in this war, but in general, in the Kremlin's sort of decision-making process, but also its military might. Olga, let's start with you.
It's a really interesting question. It is hard to speak about the domestic perception of Wagner Group because the Russian official sources tend not to mention or cover it. So a lot of Russian people, if they heard about, well, they may have heard about Prigozhin, who is the alleged founder, or he confirmed that he's the founder of the group. But if you ask an average Russian, there is a high chance that the person never heard about Prigozhin or Wagner Group. So perception domestically would be narrowed to a smaller group of people who follow the war, who probably read about it on Telegram, for example, or elsewhere on internet. I feel like the perception would be, if you support the war, if you support the goals proclaimed by the most staunch supporters of the war, you probably consider this force helpful in a way. However, inside the army, and the reason why, Wagner's group is not mentioned in the Russian state media that often, is that the army should take credit for all the efforts, or lack thereof in the war. And so taking advantage of the Wagner group and the prisoners that were attracted to the group and recruited by Prigozhin and his people is not something that the army, they appreciate the effort that has been done by these recruits, but they do not want competition to their own power and their own place within the power structure. So it's sort of a very difficult and complex balance. There is a competition that is at a personal level between the Minister of Defense and Prigozhin. These two people really don't like each other. And there is also competition at the sort of the agency level, who takes credit for what. Clearly, Prigozhin wants to get more political power, and this is a great opportunity for him. He's not an elected person. He doesn't have any position, as opposed, for example, to Ramzan Kadyrov, who is a politician and has political agency. Prigozhin has nothing except for Putin's personal support. So he is clearly waging wars left and right with the Russian politician and bureaucrats, just to get attention, just to get this sort of political credit, political capital that he can use consequently. And there is, I think, a reason for that. There is a small percentage of the Russian population that are really ultra-nationalists and doesn't have political representation. And there is a competition for this group. Could be 2-3% of the population, up to 5, maybe 10. But is this part of the population is not represented anywhere, and there is a competition for representation, and Prigozhin is one of the people who is fighting for it, and the war is clearly a good opportunity for him to do so. And as for the army, well, they clearly want to use this force, but they don't want to acknowledge or credit any of the achievements of this force because that sort of threatens their own position within the power structure. And I guess Aaron can talk more about Wagner Group as a force.
Yeah,
Yes.
Aaron, I would love to hear your comments on it too.
So I'm going to bring in something that may seem an aside, but we'll get to where I'm getting. I'm a self-professed language and etymology nerd. We'll learn more Russian today. How fun. Приgodится, приgodny is useful in Russian. It's handy, which is related to Prigozhin's name. And Wagner Group's traditional role within Russian state order was at least to conduct offhanded foreign policy, can be an influence, particularly in Africa. They've played a pretty significant role, Syria as well, can basically exert influence without the risks or costs of more serious involvement. If something goes terribly wrong, then it's just a private military company that is conducting its own business. And we have an example of that. An incident in Syria a couple of years ago where Wagner and local Syrian forces tried to attack a position of US special forces. There was a lot of infantry and small armored vehicles were fought back with B-52 bombers. That went about as well for Wagner as you might expect. And I think several hundred people died, but there was never an official protest from Russia because it wasn't Russia, it was Wagner, it was this group. As far as the actual relationships at play here, and this is where the kind of Kremlinology comes in, so we'll talk about what we do know. I think it's important to think about how Russian governance works from what we do know at a kind of a high level. There's kind of an assumption because Putin is an autocratic figure that he is pulling and directing every single lever in power in Russia. And that's really not the case. And there's evidence recently, especially with domestic policy, that Putin has become gradually more and more isolated and less involved in the day-to-day mortal plane. A lot of his role seems to be mediating and balancing between rival interest groups. And so pulling Wagner in is a challenge to the army, which I think took a lot of criticism for mishandling the war initially. I mean, this relates another aside, but in soccer, when you have a forward, a striker who's not doing well, what a lot of teams will do is they'll, over a transfer window, bring in another striker, bring in some competition. And so Wagner being brought in, I think, may have forced the army to reconsider. I think, and this is purely conjecture, but with Wagner gaining more credibility, Putin allowing Wagner to fight for Bakhmut and take massive, massive, massive casualties, and then cutting off Wagner's access to the prison population for a variety of reasons was a way to, again, balance interests. Wagner got too powerful too quickly, too big for its pants, and that became unacceptable for Putin. Again, conjecture, I can't actually tell you what he's thinking, but we do know that a lot of Putin's work is in mediating between interest groups and bases of power.
Thank you, and I think this is really insightful. I want to turn this one over to Andras first. Bob Hamilton asks, is the war causing a rift within the Kremlin and the Kremlin elites? And I want to sort of direct that to, the oligarchs. The war is proving to be, bad for business, bad for fun, bad for, all the assets, right, that the oligarchs have, especially in the West. Lots of limitations in terms of their access to the West. And Andras, you as someone who, again, monitors sort of the Russian economy and the financial dealings of the Russian elites, how do you perceive the role of this war in the sort of the internal harmony, if you will, within the Kremlin elites? And then I'll turn it over to Olga and Aaron as well for sort of their commentary.
Yeah, so without claiming that I have super exclusive sources in the Kremlin, as I know sometimes some people do, and sometimes they do. So I just want to tell you what I see, and and pick it up from where I left off when I was speaking about the how there was no sudden collapse of the economy, but the sanctions did expose and exacerbate some of the pre-existing structural weaknesses of not just the economy, but also governance. So, for instance, when we talk about Russia's trade pivot that it needed to undertake because it lost its export markets in Europe, a lot of the export infrastructure was Europe facing and not Asia facing, but now you suddenly have you face huge upfront costs if you want to build an infrastructure that takes the same wares, be they steel, coal, gas, oil, what have you, to Asia. And of course, if you build it, even if you build it, that will cost money. That money will have to come from somewhere else. And as we see, the government is prioritizing not capital investments, but the military and domestic security. Or you have to kind of make do with what you have. And we already see that this is leading to competition between various industries. For instance, when it comes to the Russian railways, which had a very insufficient export capacity towards the east. Now we have coal, we have steel, we have timber, we have sort of manufactured products, all buying for the same limited capacity, and the steel makers, for instance, asking the Russian government for guarantees to that they are able to export a certain amount of steel through those railway lines. At the same time, expanding the capacity of the same of that railway is running into problems, partly because of sanctions. So these create what I would call smaller. I don't want to call them micro conflicts, but because they're not that small. But they are not these are not conflicts that take place between Putin and and oligarchs, or however you want to call them, or industry representatives, but between industry representatives. Now, this technically, based on what Aaron said, could also be good for Putin, because he as long as he is able to preserve his position as a mediator between these various industry groups, but very often it is not him who is tasked to sort of resolve an issue that sets one interest group against another. So we have that, but when it comes to so this can cause problems this year, I think, or at least the next year, when certain interests will have to be pushed back in favor of others. We could have more open conflicts that can escalate if they are not handled, they're not kept under lid, if the system loses its capacity to keep these under lid. When it comes to the actual dealings between the Kremlin and the business elite, I think the latest thing that we saw was when the Kremlin demanded a 300 billion ruble one-time payment in order to pluck the ballooning deficit of this year. And after a lot of back and forth, the business representatives seem to have grumblingly acquiesced to that. And I think for a Kremlin that is very short-term focused and is trying to just seeing itself through the next couple of months, because it believes that after that, just a couple of months, victory is there, or whatever final settlement comes in Ukraine will be in the Kremlin's favor, and afterwards everything can be back to normal. That's good enough. And as long as people believe that this is going to happen, and believe the sort of are willing to take this short-term bet, this is good enough for the Kremlin. The problems start when more and more people realize that the short-term bet is not going to work out. Is it going to happen this year? We don't know. Based on what we know about business and political elites and what they think from investigative reporting, so far there is desperation, there is grumbling, there is not a lot of pushback.
Thank you, Andres. I want to turn this over to Aaron and sort of weave in another audience question that we have from Ben Pributok. He asks about Lavrov's role, whether or not he was, sort of briefed at the outset of the war, how much of a role he has had in the decision-making process, whether or not he still is sort of in favor or whether he is in disfavor with Putin. So kind of goes back to the inner workings of the Kremlin and the elites, but primarily what's happening with Lavrov and his role there. And
Yeah,
for the sake of time, I'll just give you a couple minutes, Aaron, so I can then turn it over to Olga with our final question.
With the caveat that I don't know anything that hasn't been reported, like Andras, I don't have any inside sources in the Kremlin. It seems to be the case that particularly since the onset of this war in Ukraine 8 or so years ago, Lavrov as a figure, Russia's foreign minister, has been largely defanged. This is, again, this Politico article, can't recommend it enough, really, really awesome read. Talks about how he was more echoing talking points when meeting with Western officials before the war and not really engaging in the back and forth, tit for tat, and frankly, expert trolling that he has a reputation for. He had a reputation for being someone who could be talked to and would actually negotiate. So it seems that, at least based on the reporting, didn't seem fully aware of what was actually going on behind the scenes. There was an article in Foreign Policy several years ago, probably 5 or 6 at this point, FPRI Lavrov, talking about he's a pretty savvy actor as a diplomat, or at least was at a certain point, and encouraging Putin, not that was heated, to let him do more diplomacy. I think one of the arguments in that article was that a more savvy diplomat at the time, following the seizure of Crimea, would have known to just stop and not begin Donbass. May have been a much more fortuitous situation for Russia in the long term. But yeah, whether or not he was involved with the planning, it doesn't seem like he is empowered at the current juncture as he once was.
Thank you, Aaron. One of our audience members asked us to share that the title of that article again. So if I may ask you to put that in the chat box. And unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I want to turn the final question of this discussion to Olga Khvostunova. Olga, we got a question, which is, I think, very important about the role of Crimea versus the role of all of Ukraine in terms of the Russian public's perception of this war. So the question is, I don't know if this is true, but the annexation of Crimea had higher approval ratings than the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, or Russia's sort of special military operation, claimed special military operation in Donbass. So can you maybe speak about the special case of Crimea? Because even when we talk about the end to this war, I think Crimea remains that caveat where, again, most of my colleagues seem to agree that Crimea is not going to be an easy case to settle. So maybe you can tell us about the Russian public's perception of Crimea and its value to Russia, and what it would mean if a regime in Kremlin was to give up Crimea.
Yeah, Crimea is you're right, it's a unique case. It has unprecedented value for both Russia and the Putin regime. Scholars talk about the Crimea effect that actually pushed Putin's ratings from dropping into unprecedented highs, and this effect lasted for several years until 2018, I believe, when Putin announced an unpopular pension reform. And from what has been said ever since and discussed and researched, the Crimea effect will hold strong within Russian domestic opinion. It doesn't seem like it could be an easy solution, and Putin's personal legacy and a lot of observers are saying that he thinks about his current political course in terms of historical legacy, is rooted in him bringing Crimea back to Russia. So there is a huge historical narrative around Crimea being part of Russia, that Russian soldiers, fought for Crimea and brought it into Russian Empire. And a lot of blood has been shed there. So this is a sacred land in Russian perception. And even before the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a conversation between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And Gorbachev wanted the Soviet Union to be preserved for some time, at least, while Yeltsin was pushing for, independence. And Gorbachev's idea was that you will have a problem with Ukraine because of Crimea. Crimea will be that problem that can cause, a conflict. Well, he was, of course, right. And sort of this unsolved problem was lingering in the background, and it returned in 2014 when Putin made this decision. And it has been also said that the idea of returning Crimea, bringing back to Russia, was part of, potential plans that the Putin regime discussed way before they had the opportunity. So there was a plan actually to go in and get it back. The plan was easily implemented because it was already developed when an opportunity presented itself. So the effect of Crimea and bringing back into Russia had such a strong influence on Russian perception that Russia has finally returned to its rightful place on the international arena. Has risen from its knees. There are all these phrases that finally it's back. And so I think the Putin regime, Putin personally sees Crimea, if they are to lose it, this will be the end of the regime, the legacy of Putin, etc. So it's a critical element. And I don't see an immediate solution to that problem. Whereas support for the war in Donbass, and especially for most recent invasion and this war, it has been more declarative than actual in the Russian domestic perception. So.
Thank you so much, Olga. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today's discussion. Olga Khvostunova, Aaron Schwartzbaum, Andres Toth-Sifra, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for your time and your patience with my technical difficulties. Olga, I think we just worked out the theme for your next FPRI piece. I think there's way more to say about this issue, the Crimea effect. So I would like to encourage our audience members to keep an eye on our website, fpri.org, for future coverage of the conflict, future analysis on the Eurasia region, and also make sure you're subscribed to our emails, because we send out our Ukraine edit quite regularly, which gives you a roundup of everything we are doing to understand this war and its implications. So also make sure you follow us on social media. Thank you so much for your time. I wish all of you a great rest of your day. Again, Olga, Andres, Aaron, thank you for your time, and I very much hope you'll join me again for a continued conversation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.